Hi there, welcome back to part two. I will briefly take you through a lot of this. However, much of this you can read. I don't believe in lecturing for the sake of lecturing. A lot of these are bulleted and descriptive textually in nature, so that way you can refer back to them on your own. But I do want to discuss the most relevant pieces of it, so you will see me go ahead and track through the remaining slides on this lecture, so that way you can do that. Okay. We briefly already discussed this in the previous, or in part one of lecture two, but it's important to establish yourself as the authority in the classroom. You give commands to enforce obedience, and I say that kind of lightly because that sounds pretty strong. We want students to comply out of respect and not to submit out of fear, and I think that's an important distinction with this point, is that in creating a positive classroom environment, we should respect our students if we expect respect in return, okay? And in creating a positive environment, it's important to make your classroom a positive and interesting place to be. A lot of teachers have an individualistic style to this, and that's kind of to your taste, to your liking, to your preference, because you want to make an environment in which you are an effective teacher and efficient and you are productive, okay? But you also want to make an environment where the students are just as efficient and productive with their learning. But also, in creating that positive environment, get to know your students individually. I'm sure you've seen videos, maybe on social media or YouTube, of teachers who have an individual handshake with each student that walks into the classroom. And I'm not saying that you should do this necessarily, but think of a creative way just to get to know your students individually. It could be a one-on-one session with your student at the start of a school year, okay? It could be these occasional check-ins. It could be that, hey, I heard you had a football game. How did it go, okay? Those things carry weight and build rapport, and it's important in building a positive environment. Acknowledge students' positive achievements and behaviors. This is going back to that, making sure our positive interactions with students far outweigh our negative interactions. Monitor their progress, okay? And every student, with whatever progress they do get, stress that progress, emphasize that progress, be emphatic about it, okay? But in providing your feedback, provide constructive feedback, okay? Provide ongoing performance feedback on their own performance. We don't want our feedback to be overly critical in nature to where it's just us constantly writing them like white on rice, okay? I've discussed this point quite a bit, but I just want to kind of re-emphasize that we want to make sure that just always be intentional of monitoring and attempting to increase your own positive praise statements, okay? In the literature, we refer to this as behavior-specific praise. You can provide behavior-specific praise, which is meant for an individual student behavior specifically, or we can provide general praise to the classroom. Whatever nature it is, just make sure that these are frequent and intentional, and that you are always working to increase these, because we can't do it enough. Okay. We can enrich the classroom with incentives, rewards, reinforcers. Be a wandering reinforcer, and this is what I want to focus on with this slide the most, is that you yourself can be a reinforcer, where you provide your social praise and attention for students who are engaging in what you desire in the appropriate behaviors, okay? So make students want your attention, but make sure that they're engaging in appropriate behaviors to occasion and gain access to your attention. But when you provide your attention, always be intentional with providing it immediately when you see what you want to see, especially maybe for those 2 to 5 kids that might not be responding to whatever typical classroom management procedure that you already have in place. Provide it only contingently, okay? So if you see them engage in the behaviors that are set forth in your classroom expectations and you see them doing that, immediately provide that attention. And only when you see that, though, that positive natured attention. Be emphatic with your attention and be specific with it, behavior specific praise that we talked about. Now, so in developing our procedures, routines, make sure that we're teaching them to students, okay? This is extremely important that we teach these routines to students, especially for your younger students maybe who might be new to classroom structures, and with each year it's just a whole new learning game, okay? But don't miss out on these opportunities even with your like middle school and upper elementary students, okay, or even high school students. Teach these routines. Model how this is supposed to look, okay, and monitor students who are engaging in these expected behaviors and following the rules, and praise the mess out of it, okay. Now, when we structure the classroom environment, it's important to, making sure that we have a careful arrangement, okay, of these environments that can decrease student noise and disruption, okay. These are important, especially when you're considering, and these things are often overlooked, but you don't want your classroom environment to be a haphazard mess, okay. The physical arrangement is important to maintaining effective teaching and a learning environment. But these also help permit orderly movement, okay? One way that I would do this in my classroom as a teacher was that I would have numbers right outside the door, or right at lining up to the door. And each student would have their own number. And so when I would say line up, it wouldn't be like a mad dash for the door to see who can get first in line. There was always a designated line leader in which we'd rotate per day or per week. But each student had their number, and that was always the order that they lined up in. We would occasionally change it up, but that's just one example of how we increase or decrease the time it takes to transition, because transition time is directly related to sometimes our physical structure, okay? We make efficient use of that space and that time, and we want to keep what we need readily accessible for teaching materials. Okay. So I've already kind of went over this very briefly, okay? We want to teach these procedures and routines, but it's also important to think of how we want, or what we want students to do if, say, a couple students finish early and they're just sitting there. That's a ripe opportunity or finish early with a task and they just sit there, and that's a ripe opportunity for some misbehavior to occur, okay? We want to always be mindful of things of our time, okay? And be mindful of academic activities that we can have for students to still keep them engaged in some meaningful activity while still taking advantage of the time and the space, okay? Now, I did speak of this very briefly just a couple seconds ago, but the reason transitions are important to pay attention to is because these, again, are ripe opportunities for off-task behaviors or problems, okay? If we think of back to my lining up example, the reason I did that after my first year of teaching was because lining up was always a headache. It was always a student who was always pushing or shoving, trying to get that best spot in line, even though we were all going to the same place. Now, keep in mind, I taught kindergarten through third grade. So special education. So, my students were a bit younger, where it mattered who was where in what place in line, okay? But these cost us time, okay? I learned quickly that I had to maximize that opportunity, and that decreased just a whole nother 3 minutes of extra time that we spent on the academic activity right before lining up to transition to another place, or even transitioning in between subjects. Think of these systems that maximize instructional time. And I'm skipping slides right now because this previous slide that I just spoke on providing assistance, this refers to frequently monitoring students, assisting if you detect that students might be in need of assistance, but also teaching students how to request assistance is critical. We'll discuss that piece when we discuss future dimensions of classroom management, but make sure that we're frequently moving around the classroom. Don't just park yourself in one spot and expect students to constantly come to you, okay? A stationary teacher is oftentimes ineffective in making sure and monitoring all students are attending to what they need to attend to, or are completing it successfully, or are in need of assistance. But a moving teacher is able to detect that quite easily. Okay. Now, I want to kind of go back to developing these classroom rules. I've already discussed at length about teaching these rules at the beginning of the year. But instruction alone, didactic instruction alone, just verbally describing that might not be enough to actually teach students the rules specific to your classroom, okay? We also need to model what these behaviors look like, right? Now, that's going to be specific to what your classroom rules are. But then it's critical to also provide an opportunity for students to practice and rehearse these rules. I would have to do this for at least the first month of teaching elementary age students, okay? Don't forget that this is an important piece to model and actually practice these rules. Don't expect that your word alone is enough to carry a complete acquisition, okay, for these rules for students. We want to keep our rules to a minimum. We don't want to have big paragraphs of rules. We want them to be simple, brief, and parsimonious in nature, okay? We want them to be positive if possible. Again, what I mean by positive, we don't want to phrase a rule as saying, do not run. Instead of a positive way to speak, that would be, we will walk, okay? We want these rules to be specific and observable. Don't make these rules subjective in nature to where students have to guess what good hands are, okay? I've seen that rule pop up quite a bit. Now, there's nothing wrong with the rule. Many students will be able to discern what good hands are, but we have to be able to specifically describe and operationally define what are good hands. It might be that we keep our hands in our lap and to ourselves and we don't touch other students without their permission. We don't use our hands and our feet to physically harm other students, okay? We want to keep this in kid-friendly language, though. We don't necessarily need to provide a operational definition of behavior that we might provide to adults. Keep this commensurate with their age, okay? And include a compliance rule. This might be the most important rule that you establish now, and students can't learn if the directions that you give during the course of the day aren't followed, okay? So the compliance rule, it could be that we will follow all teacher directives, okay? But in that alone isn't enough oftentimes for students to comply with your direction. You might need more tiered individual behavior supports to encourage compliance. Because remember, we don't want students to submit out of fear. We want them to comply out of respect, okay? Building all of that positive classroom environment and establishing these rules, but also providing frequent praise and feedback and monitoring students if they need assistance. All this stuff works in tandem to promote compliance. Now, consequences don't always have to be punitive in nature, okay? For example, your social praise, your behavior-specific praise, the attention that you give to students when they engage in appropriate behaviors or desired behaviors or follow the rules, that's an example of a consequence. That's you providing attention for a behavior. Now, consequences can also be punitive in nature, where a student might get sent to an administrator's office. A student might lose access to a privilege or a desirable item or activity. Those are consequences also. But don't forget the power of your praise, okay? That's probably one of the most powerful tools in your arsenal that you have to increase appropriate behaviors. Now, when you administer consequences, it's important that when students choose not to follow the rules, they should experience these consistent consequences, okay? These need to be predictable and consistent. You can describe this at the beginning of the year when you're setting up your classroom management system, and we'll kind of go into what some consequences and what examples of these could be, okay? But have multiple tiers for these alternatives. It can't just be a jump to an immediate consequence. It might be that you need to provide a warning at first, and then the consequence, and then include a plan for how we might avoid the consequence when it is administered. There will be times where we might be able to anticipate problem behavior before it even occurs. And this could happen as a result of a student who reliably engages in challenging behavior, maybe at the start of an academic block or when transitioning to a non-preferred task, okay? Whenever you can anticipate these, it's beneficial to use pre-correction procedures. And in a systematic pre-correction procedure might be to privately remind the student of the rule that they're expected to abide by. We can encourage students to adhere to the rule, and then we can move on. But a critical component to this is to provide praise if we see that the student is engaging in the appropriate and desired behavior and abiding by these rules. Now, This is the end of lecture 2. Tune in for lecture 3.